Hello, and welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Matthew Jordan, and I'm an instructor at McMaster University, a psychology researcher, and a funk musician. I'm extremely excited to be joined today by Stuart Ritchie, a psychologist at King's College London and the author of Science Fictions, Exposing Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype in Science. This book is, in my view, the definitive resource for learning about how the current scientific system incentivizes bad behavior on the part of researchers, and it includes many sensible ways we can tangibly change the system for the better. Stuart, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
This book talks about so much: peer review, replication crisis, data manipulation, researcher bias, media hype, and much more. But in this interview, I'd like to specifically focus on ways that even the most well-intentioned scientists can introduce errors or produce untrustworthy results without any malicious intent. If the listeners are looking for malicious intent, they can pick up the book. There are many excellent chapters on that as well. But before we get into that, maybe we can start by speaking about the event that drew a lot of the problems you discuss to the attention of researchers and the public at large. And that event was the replication crisis. So maybe let's just start here. What exactly is the replication crisis in science?
Well, it was a term that was first used in psychology in about 2012, I think, was when the first time anyone talked about a crisis of replicability. And it came about because there were two or three very prominent stories of papers that we thought we could rely on, that were part of a larger kind of theory in psychology, that when independent groups tried to replicate them, they found that they couldn't get the same results. So one example was in the world of social psychology was priming research. So the idea that you can unconsciously prime people with, one example was this experiment which was done in the 90s. And the idea was that you could prime people with the idea of elderly people. So you had them do a little experiment in the lab, and it was just about like filling in sentences that were incomplete. And unbeknownst to half of the participants, they were shown words that had to do with old people, and the other half were just shown kind of random words. So the words were stuff like, I don't know, grey. I think one of the words was Florida, which in the US is associated with older people.
Yes.
And then the idea, or the kind of major result of the experiment was that the people who had seen the words that related to older people walked more slowly out of the lab than the people who had just seen random words. And so the idea was that the words had primed the concept of being elderly, being old, being slow, and thus the people actually behaved differently, even though they'd just been unconsciously primed of this. It's not like they were told to do this, or it was even hinted at them to walk more slowly. And that kind of spawned a whole, or that was part of a whole line of research on this kind of idea of behavioral priming, where words and concepts and metaphors can prime people's actions and behaviors and beliefs in really quite strong ways. A few of those famous studies were included in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. They were published in some of the top psychology journals. But around about 2011, 2012, people started actually doing direct replications of them. So instead of doing what's been called conceptual replications, where you kind of do the same experiment but can add your own twist or move on and do something different, people actually tried to run exactly the same experiments again, and they found not a great set of results. That is, they found that they couldn't find the same results, and when they could find when the results were statistically significant, that is, that they were distinguishable from chance in some way. I'm sure we'll get into what that term means, statistically significant, and all the trouble Absolutely. It's caused. But when they were distinguishable from chance in some way, they had much, much smaller effects than the ones that had been published. So basically, there's loads of this research in the psychology literature which seems to be unreliable and was hitherto not really thought of as being unreliable, was hitherto thought of as being the kind of foundation for lots and lots of future research. And so various other things happened, including a really prominent fraud case and a couple of other things around about 2011-12. And then people started thinking, wow, this is what we might call a crisis. This is really quite serious. And so since then, psychologists have tried to do these large-scale attempts to replicate lots and lots of studies that are published in some of the top journals in psychology, and then in social science more generally, economics. And then the idea has kind of bled out into other fields of science as well. So you're seeing ecologists talk about this, evolutionary biologists, cell biologists, machine learning researchers, computer science researchers. Chemists talk about it, and it kind of gets further and further out away from psychology, and scientists in general have been realizing that they've got all these major problems of replicability. They can't seem to get the same results very reliably as the original studies do. And I should also add to the list medical research, which is possibly the scariest part of that.
I was taught in my, high school scientific classes that replication is kind of the cornerstone of the scientific process, right? No results in science mean anything until someone else can verify the whole thing. That was the point of having scientific literature in the first place. People could publish their discussion of what they did. If you look back at, in the 16th and 17th century, we've got these long rambling stories of members of the Royal Society telling you exactly everything they did in the day and what happened as a result, so that other scientists could attempt to do the same. If replication is this so-called benchmark of the scientific process, how could it be possible that so many of these major findings and results were unable to meet this basic criterion for what we define as scientific fact?
It's a great question. The whole point of writing a scientific paper in the first place, why scientific papers were invented, was to share the methods and the understanding is that in theory, at least, you might not have all the money, you might not be able to create a new particle accelerator or whatever it happens to be, but in theory you should be able to go back and do the same experiment again and get something similar to the results. There are many reasons. One is that simply the papers don't report what was actually done in the experiment. And I don't mean that you use the word kind of malicious. I don't mean that it's done in a sort of malicious way. It's just that the papers are sloppily written, so they don't actually describe what the scientists did accurately. And that's what a lot of would-be replicators have found. They've gone with the intention of replicating a paper. This happened very prominently in cancer research, where 50 papers were selected for replication, and they couldn't, not a single one of them, they couldn't even, for not one single one of those papers, they couldn't even begin to, sorry, I'm getting myself into all double negatives here.
That's all right.
For not one of those papers could the would-be replicators actually replicate the study without having to go and contact the authors and have a huge back and forth with them and ask them for loads of details. And the authors had to email postdoctoral researchers who used to work in their labs and don't anymore and say, what exactly did you do with this? What reagent did you use here? Which strain of cells did you use here? And had to go back and do all this. So that's one problem, is that the original papers just don't actually report what was done, which seems amazing, really. I mean, the whole point of a scientific paper, as I say, is that it reports that. And what if you, God forbid, what if you walk out and get hit by a bus tomorrow? Someone should be able to look back at your research that you published and run that same experiment again. Otherwise, the contribution that you've made to science is a bit unclear. So that's one reason. The other reason is that some papers are just made up. That's the most extreme reason. Some papers are just the experiment never happened in the first place. It was just falsified. That's the really kind of hardcore malicious end. And then the other reason is that the statistics that are reported, the way that the experiment is written up, is biased. Or spun in some way, so the statistics are not done accurately. They're done with sort of a sometimes unconscious intention of finding particular results, and thus they're found that. We can get into more detail about that, or they're written in such a way that makes it seem like the results are more powerful, more interesting, more groundbreaking than they actually are. So that's the kind of hype aspect of it, that scientists don't just hype up their results when they talk about them in the press or to the media or whatever it happens to be, but they hype their results up within the scientific papers themselves. So actually, the way that they're written up, if you dig into the numbers, often doesn't reflect what was found. So there's all these different reasons, and that's what each chapter of the book is. There's a fraud chapter and a bias chapter and a negligence chapter where the scientists have just made mistakes. They've just made a typo in their paper, or they've forgotten to do some really important part of their lab procedure, like making sure that everything's sterilized. And so there's this big problem in cell biology where they have all this contamination that comes in and contaminates loads of papers. Thousands of papers might have been affected by this problem, or they get the statistics wrong. And so there's loads of different ways it can happen, but it all adds up to a scientific literature that's full of papers which you just can't rely on. They look as if they're scientific papers. They are written up as if they're scientific papers. They're often put out into the media as if they're real scientific contributions, but they don't actually form the foundation that we need to advance our knowledge of the world.
Yeah, it's really important the way you point out how many of these issues are systematic problems with the way that science itself is conducted, the way that we apply for grants, write papers, gather data, analyze data, publish those results, share them with the media. You kind of chronicle in an amazing way how each stage of this scientific process works and how error can creep in at each of the stages. Maybe you can take us through those stages of the scientific process from writing a grant to publication and beyond. In the book, you have an excellent kind of story. And so maybe for the listeners who are not scientists or who have never participated in the scientific process, how does science actually get done in the 21st century?
Yeah, the reason I added that is I think a lot of people, including, I kind of noticed this when I talk to undergraduate students who have got all these papers. They're being given papers by their professors to read and analyze, and they don't actually know how those papers came about in the first place, like where they came from. And I think that's a similar situation that members of the public find themselves. They see papers, scientific studies discussed in the media. Particularly, you see a lot of them now in the pandemic. There's endless scientific papers appearing constantly about different aspects of COVID-19. And you got to ask the question, like, where did they come from? So I have this description of the peer review process where I talk about, first of all, you've got to get some money to do an experiment. So so scientists spend an inordinate amount of time writing up grant applications to send to government research bodies or charities to ask for money to do the experiment. So you've got to try and differentiate yourself there. And instantly there's a point where, some certain biases can come in. You can write up your intentions, your plans for what you're going to do in a way that make it sound like you're going to make an absolutely massive, exciting breakthrough and produce all this groundbreaking research, which maybe is not necessarily what you're going to do. Maybe you're going to make an incremental contribution, which is fine, but there's that competition comes in there, and so you have to kind of hype things up a little bit. And then once you've got the money, which doesn't happen very often, rejection is very, very common for grant applications. But let's say you do get a grant application and you run the experiment, whatever it happens to be, the study, and that can sometimes take years or days or whatever it happens to be across different fields of research. And then you'll analyze it with some sort of statistics. At which point there are lots of biases that can creep in. We can talk about that in more detail of the actual, statistical biases. But that's one point. That's one kind of weak point where scientists are running the analysis of an experiment that they themselves did, and thus they have a kind of idea as to what they want it to look like, what they want those results to look like, what sort of things they want to be able to say on the basis of those results. And so, given that scientists are human beings, you can see why that would be a possible source of bias. Then they submit the paper once they've written it up, done the analysis, they write it all down, send it to a scientific journal. And there's another point at which another kind of weak point is that I'm making the assumption that they send it to a scientific journal, but actually, if you don't get the results you want, and any kind of fiddling with the data, any kind of biased fiddling with the data doesn't help you get those results, you often just stick the paper in the file drawer, right? So that's a kind of an anachronistic term for people not publishing the research they want. But this idea of the file drawer effect, where if you find disappointing results, you find results that don't support your particular theory, that make it look like the drug you're investigating doesn't work, or the particle you theorize doesn't exist, or whatever it happens to be, you would just chuck that one in the file drawer rather than sending it off to an exciting journal to get published. And the journals themselves are also only interested in, or mainly interested in, results that they see as advancing science in some way. So that doesn't necessarily include, here's my boring flat results that don't make any, that don't really discover anything new, but it does include flashy, exciting results that seem to advance our knowledge in some major and substantive way. So there's another point where bias can come in, is that the journal editor, so who's in charge of choosing which articles get accepted into their journal, they are interested in the most exciting and flashy research too. Then, of course, it gets sent out for peer review. So sent to other scientists who review your paper and check. They're supposed to check whether the statistics are right, and check whether you're making claims that are actually based on the data. And of course, the problem there is that those people are scientists themselves too, right? Those are busy scientists who are very prone to taking their eye off the ball when it comes to peer review. They're not often provided with the raw data that you collected. They're just provided with your summary and your write-up of it. I've already said that scientists often write up their papers as if the results were much more exciting and interesting than they really were. So there's a kind of the spin problem there. And peer reviewers are not necessarily trained. They're certainly not paid. They do this out of the goodness of their hearts, and so it's not something that is the system is not as good as it could be for being what it's supposed to be, which is the kind of ultimate gatekeeping device for keeping out bad science from the literature. So there's another problem. And then once the paper is actually published in the journal, if it actually gets in, because of course the peer reviewers can write a really nasty review and get your paper rejected from the journal. But if it does get accepted, then there's another problem, which is when the paper actually makes it out into the real world, and all sorts of hype and extra publicity and marketing can come in there. So that's all the kind of all the kind of weak points along the process of from doing the experiment all the way to doing it, and that's without even discussing how you set the experiment up in the first place. I mean, maybe it was just a bad study, right? There's lots of reasons why certain types of research, certain types of study, and these are specific to the kinds of subjects, that are being researched. So maybe the participants you had in your study are a biased subsection of the population, and so actually, really, no matter what you discovered on them, it wouldn't be generalizable to the general population. Maybe you use the wrong statistical test that everyone's been using, but is actually incorrect. Maybe there's all sorts of reasons that are specific to different subjects that might mean that the research was bad in the first place. So, even taking that into account, there's all these different ways where research can fall apart, essentially. And so we end up with at the end of that, a literature that doesn't actually represent all the science that's been done. So there's an amazing study which I cite in the book, where it was on antidepressants. So it was on trials of antidepressants, and at the start of the process, they knew this because there was a registry for these trials. So they knew that 50 studies had been done which showed that the antidepressant worked, and 50 or so had been done that showed that the antidepressant didn't work. So it was about 50-50. That's what the reality was, that's 50 positive trials and 50 negative trials. But by the time they'd been through this whole system that I just described, almost all of those negative trials had disappeared. Very, very few of them got published. Very, very few of them got cited in future. And some of the studies that originally appeared negative were spun to make it look as if they were positive. So the way that the literature looks is a really distorted view of the actual science that's been done. And that is the main problem.
Yeah, I'm reminded of an excellent quote you had at some point in the book, where you're describing that science, unlike many other areas of inquiry or fields or lines of work, is actually meant to be, the sum total of all of our knowledge and understanding about the world, including are confessions of stuff not being understood or not going the way we wanted. I forget the analogy you make, but in my head it was something to the effect of, when you build a product and it doesn't work, you don't put that on the market. But in science, if you run a study and it doesn't work, you really should be putting that in the literature, because our responsibility as scientists is to kind of say everything there is to say about everything that we are investigating.
Yeah, another good analogy for it, I think, is to think of it like the historical record. Historians know,
Right.
when they look at the historical record, they know that lots of sources are really biased. History is written by the victors, is the classic phrase. But
Right.
that stands in for loads of different biases and ways that uh, uh, historical sources can be distorted, and so you have to do your historiography, and you have to say, well, no, I kind of rate this source more reliable than this one, and so on. Unfortunately, the scientific literature is like that too, but it shouldn't be. There's no reason in the perfect world that the scientific literature should be full of biases and full of holes, essentially, where there's just no research published, even though that research was done. The historical record, or the archaeological record even, is full of holes, because we'd expect that things rot
Right.
away and don't turn into archaeological discoveries. People destroy historical records that are not favorable to whatever faction they're from. This happens all the time, but in science that shouldn't happen. The scientific literature is supposed to be a list, as you say, of things that have been done by scientists, positive or negative. They're experimenting, right? They're not going to have exciting results every single time. They're not going to make a groundbreaking discovery in every single experiment, but they should be putting that out there into the world. So the scientific literature is a bit like the historical record, but it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating, because as a student studying psychology, and even now doing psychology research, you're told by your supervisor or your PI or grad students, if there's a null result, don't publish that, right? We don't disclose null results. That's not fit for publication. And so it's interesting how a lot of these kind of issues that you're discussing are just kind of embedded into the culture of what is considered acceptable to share with the scientific community in the results of your analysis. Maybe you can say a bit about why journals might be hesitant to publish results that are don't find flashy findings, or for that matter, don't find significant findings at all, null results as they're called. And so why researchers then might not be interested in sharing those results. And so we end up with this file drawer problem, as you describe.
Yeah, it's kind of a vicious circle, because the researchers know that the journals are not interested in publishing it, and so they file drawer the stuff, and so they only send the positive results to the journals, and then the journals get used to just publishing lots of positive results, and so it kind of goes on and on like that, as I say, in a vicious circle.
Yeah.
The reason is that so there's several reasons. We all have a kind of human, I think, bias towards exciting stuff rather than boring stuff, right? It seems an obvious thing to say, but we all want to see stuff happening. We want to see progress being made. A trial that says this drug is really effective against depression, say, is more interesting to us than a trial that says we tried this drug and it doesn't work. So there's that bias in the first place. People want to help. Scientists want to help. They want to have some, have some idea that they are that what they're doing is useful, that they're making a contribution to the world. So that's one reason. Another reason is that positive results are cited more, and journals are, in some, not all journals, but many journals are commercial enterprises. They're owned by for-profit publishers, and they want their journals to be successful in the kind of marketplace of different scientific outlets. And success is measured in the number of citations that articles get. And because of this bias towards positive and interesting and fruitful results, scientists will tend to cite positive results more often than negative or null ones. So the journals get more attention. The journals get more citations. They get more. They get a higher H index, a higher impact factor, I should say, which is the way that we measure a journal's number of citations. So the really high impact factor journals are places like Nature and Science. And they've got, impact factors in the 30s and 40s. The average paper that gets published there will will get cited 40 times. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's basically what it means. And so that's what they want. They want their journal to remain prestigious and to be a place where if you send your research, then it's among the articles that are really making a big splash in the world of science. And so that can really push editors towards not being interested in publishing null results. And and again, that feeds back to the scientists themselves. And as you say, you often talk to people who they see a null result and they come to you and say, I'm really disappointed. I found a null result in this experiment. I'm really discouraged by this. I have it with my students regularly say, unfortunately, this one wasn't significant, and I have to say to them, I know that's how you feel. Like, I know that it seems disappointing, but that shouldn't be. If an experiment is interesting and was set up in a decent way, the fact that you didn't find anything will be interesting too, and does count as scientific progress. So this whole the addiction we have to finding positive results is really throwing science off track.
I will say that was definitely the most unexpected experience I had coming to graduate school in psychology. I didn't do my undergrad in psychology, so I wasn't really, I did my undergrad in math and physics, where we don't really talk about significant results so much, certainly not at the undergraduate level. But then when I got to grad school and I heard people saying exactly what you're describing, unfortunately, this wasn't significant. Oh, I did, I got a null result. I had the exact same feeling you did of thinking, but the result is whatever the result is. That is the scientific process.
Yeah.
Our goal is to kind of query nature and let nature kind of tell us what, whether our hypotheses are right or wrong. And whatever the answer is, that's the answer. And we can't have preferences because that defeats the whole purpose of doing science in the first place.
I have a quote from Darwin in the book where he says, a scientist, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but a scientist should have no desires about the results. They should just have a heart of stone. And I think that's, I think that's, it's unrealistic because we are all human beings, but it's what we should be telling students rather than, I think either explicitly or implicitly, a lot of senior researchers communicate to students that what they want is positive results, right? What they want is results that are statistically significant and that they can publish in journals, in big exciting journals. And I have examples in the book of scientists explicitly saying that to their students. So there's a leaked email from a scientist that I quote, where he says, to his graduate students, I really wish we could just get this result to be significant because I don't really understand why it's not significant. Rather than saying what he should have said, which was, oh well, those are the results. Let's write them up in an honest way, and maybe that'll still be of interest to people because we set up an experiment in such a way that actually makes a difference. So, this bias it's rarely as explicit as that, like a literal email saying, "Could you please go back and run the statistics again and make this one work?" in inverted commas, but it's still a thing which is implicitly, that slump that people get when, it's not significant. That's not how it should be.
Right. Yeah, and like you mentioned, we kind of have a tendency towards exciting results or, flashy ideas or super numerically significant results as well. But, maybe part of the problem here is that scientists are not educated as part of their scientific education in a lot of the issues that you describe in your book. When you talk about the scientific process from grant writing to publication to media promotion, I only really, like many people, really only discovered how that process worked a couple of years into being in graduate school. And so we're not really informed about how these different parts play together when we're just starting in our scientific education. And in reality, what we should be learning is that science, most of the time, is a rather slow, incremental, frankly, somewhat boring process that as individual scientists, we can be invested in and we can be excited about and we can love our data and love our studies. But the expectation that everything is going to be flashy and exciting every time probably does a disservice.
It's another thing. Like I mentioned, peer reviewers aren't aren't paid or even trained how to do peer review. Like no one ever actually formally tells you how to do this, and it's another part of the scientific process where you're just sort of thrown in there. You go into science to you're trained in maybe lab techniques or whatever it happens to be, statistical techniques, but you're not trained in this general scientific ecosystem and how things work. And that's it's part of why I wrote this book is to give people a kind of view of the inside of how that process really works.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And that's why it's such a useful resource. I'd like to turn now to something that we've been kind of hinting at throughout this conversation, which is the way that statistical analysis can go awry and can introduce a great deal of bias into the production of scientific knowledge. Maybe to people who have never really done statistics or thought much about it, why is it not the case that you have your data, you run your statistics, you get your answer, and you publish the result? Why is the process of statistical analysis not that simple?
Unfortunately, a lot of scientists seem to think that it is that simple, and
Right.
that's unfortunately the reality. But you're right, it isn't that simple. And that, the main reason for that is that statistics is itself an evolving scientific subject. The statistical techniques that we use are not the same ones that were being used. Um, just a few years ago, new techniques get developed all the time, and weaknesses in those statistical techniques are often discovered. Now, there are some things which have been around for a long time and have been debated endlessly and so on. But unfortunately, there are ways that those statistical techniques can be manipulated consciously or unconsciously by scientists who are using them. So it's not just as simple as we're going to run this particular statistical test on this data and we get the result and then that's it. There are ways once you've got your result of saying, well, I wonder if we can just try that again with, maybe just a slight little change. I didn't think of this beforehand, but actually, it is right if we drop out this particular participant, or actually, it is right if we control for this variable that we didn't think of. So maybe we control for how tall the participants were, or we control for their sex, or we control for their socioeconomic status, or whatever it happens to be. Let's throw that in. I think that probably makes most sense. You can convince yourself into running a very specific analysis that wasn't what you would have originally done. It wasn't what you would have said you were going to do before you touch the data, but it's something which you run. And critically, the main problem with that is the more of these analyses that you run, the more of these new kind of permutations on the original analysis you run, the more likely you are to run into just a chance finding, a false positive result. And that's one of the major reasons that so many of these papers are unreliable, is that the scientists just sort of did the analysis as they went along. I've said this in the book, but I think if you asked the average person, you just bumped into someone in the street and said, "Do you think scientists plan out their analysis from before they look at their data, and then they have a really clear idea of how their hypothesis is going to be tested, and then they get their data and then they run that analysis, and then that's the end of it?" Or that that's option A. Option B is they kind of have a vague idea in their head, and then they collect the data and they sort of think, well, I'll try this one and I'll try this one, and this analysis didn't quite give me what I want, so I'm going to just try this little variation on it, or I'm going to drop this person out, and they let themselves be led by the data into an analysis. Which do you think they would do? And I think the average person would say, well, obviously it's A, right? The B sounds like a terrible idea. But scientists are doing B all the time. Scientists are constantly doing B. They are constantly letting the data lead them into their analysis, rather than having a principled plan for their analysis before they touch any of the data. So, and this is one of the major reasons that we get false positive results, because if you just keep trying stuff, if you just keep messing around with the numbers, you will eventually find something, something publishable, probably something that's statistically significant. And that is, a massively underappreciated fact. Again, when senior scientists say to their PhD students, maybe just try that one again. What they're saying is roll the dice again, and there's a possibility if you roll the dice again, you will get a double six or whatever it is you're looking for, which maybe just came up by chance and is not really a reflection of the actual phenomenon that you're studying.
we've been kind of circling around this notion of significant results. You've talked about this idea kind of in quotes of having a good result, whatever that means. And the kind of benchmark that we've established in science for what it means for a result to be significant is tied to this concept of a p-value, which, as you discuss in the book, some 80+% of textbooks that define the p-value do it wrong.
Yeah.
And so this is a deeply misunderstood idea. There are entire courses on Coursera. Daniel Lackins has a whole course just on understanding a p-value. I mean, this is often given, 20 minutes of introductory psychology material, but we can take a whole Coursera course on it. Maybe let's attempt to just do it now in a couple minutes. I'm sure you've rehearsed this definition many times. What exactly is a p-value, and how did it come to be kind of the gold standard of what it means for a scientific result or statistical analysis to be legitimate or significant?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to analyze your data. That's kind of an answer to your previous question as well. Is that there are lots of different ways of doing it. It's just that the p-value way of doing it, so this idea of null hypothesis significance testing that it's been called, has become the dominant scheme that people use. So a p-value is in a world where the thing that you're looking for is not true. So that's what scientists call the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is true. There's actually nothing going on in your data. Your drug doesn't work. Your particle doesn't actually provide an energy signal. Your brain region isn't actually related to this particular aspect of people's personality. Whatever it is, it doesn't happen, right? So imagine a world where that just is not happening. What is the probability that you would get results that look like the results in your data if in fact there's nothing going on, right? And me saying that there, and it does have a more technical definition. That's a kind of a popularized definition of it. Mm-hmm. But me saying that there makes it sound like it's relatively straightforward. But when you think about it, it's actually quite a backwards thing. There, you're asking if my result doesn't exist, how likely would it be that I would get my data? Right. And obviously, what you want is a really low likelihood of that, because what you want is your data to look as if to make it look as if your result does actually your hypothesis is actually correct, that there is something true. I almost used the word true there, but there is something realistic about your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is compatible with the data, or at least incompatible with there being nothing going on. Mm-hmm. So that quite complex, convoluted thing is constantly misstated in statistics, in scientific papers, in statistical textbooks, as you say. These are psychology textbooks. I think 89% of them is the number that got the definition wrong in some way. There's a kind of audit study that was done, and they define it as things like the probability that the null hypothesis is wrong, which is not what I just said, and it turns out to be slightly different, or the probability that your results are important, or the strength of your results, or the importance of your results, or there are lots of different ways of kind of coming up with what a p-value means that kind of get at what we sort of mean by it, but are actually technically wrong. And there's been this kind of conflation of what we want the p-value to tell us, which is how exciting and important are my findings, to what the p-value actually technically tells us, which is something very far off from that. But unfortunately, where the p-value is often used, it's basically a stand-in for this finding is real, because Ronald Fisher, the early 20th century statistician and geneticist, and eugenicist, I should say as well. Not a brilliant character, I must say. But he did make many contributions to early statistics, and one of his contributions was to come up with this idea of statistical significance. So to choose a p-value threshold under which we will accept that the results are, to some degree of interest to us. And he chose the word significance, which to our ears sounds a bit different from how it sounded. The definition of that word has shifted slightly from how he first used it. But his idea was that if you keep getting results that are less than 5%, have a p-value that's lower than 5%, so 0.05, then that can be classed as statistically significant. And that was kind of his starting suggestion that maybe people would change the p-value or change the p-value level depending on the experiment they're doing and the context of the results and so on. But actually, it's just become like the total hidebound, ingrained, way that we do research, which is that we look for p-values less than 0.05. And if they are less than 0.05, we consider that result statistically significant. And unfortunately, that has morphed into true in some extent, right? So it's statistically significant as results are the ones that are classed as probably true, and statistically non-significant results with p-values that are higher than 0.05 are classed as somehow not true or just chance in some way. And that's not technically correct. That's not what the statistics are telling us. And we need to have a much more nuanced understanding of what those statistics are telling us. But unfortunately, that is the standard practice. And so psychologists and scientists across essentially every field spend ages looking through their results tables in the p-value column and find anything that's lower than 0.05, and they put a little asterisk by it and they say, well, these are the results that are in some sense true. So we turn this continuous number into an arbitrary sort of dichotomy between true and false. And that is the decision on which people make their publication. So that's the criterion on which people make their publication decisions, right? If it's significant, they'll send it off to be published. If it's non-significant, it gets file drawered. And so that's what kind of deranges the scientific literature in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite the complicated process. And even when you're speaking there, and you are, of course, a brilliant expositor of these ideas, even then it can be really difficult to wrap your head around. So I think an additional problem here is that statistics is just hard. And maybe we're not honest with ourselves a lot of the times in recognizing that what we are doing when we do statistical analysis is not at all an intuitive process. This is a, human tool we invented for making sense of complicated information in the world. And, the fact that we give undergrads a single course in statistical analysis and then expect them to go out and do research is really kind of doing a disservice to just how complicated a lot of these ideas are. And I will say, having been in this field for a few years, I certainly don't feel entirely confident in a lot of the statistical analyses I do. And frankly, I'm not convinced that many of my peers or even elders, as it were, in the field are either. So, I mean, I think it's just really complicated to think through a lot of these things. This idea of the p-value, you have a wonderful explanation in the book of, of course, this 5%, right? This P is less than 5%, which is to say, if there were no phenomenon happening, there would be a 5% chance that I would observe what I observe. So that is a good inclination to suggest that what you're seeing is actually, noteworthy or compatible with there actually being a phenomenon. As you say, we want to avoid the word true. But there are people who run analyses where P is just slightly bigger than 5%. And so because we have this arbitrary cutoff, you have these incredible examples of our results are trending towards significance. Our results are approaching the significance threshold. These when you really think about and understand what's happening here, just this totally arbitrary cutoff leading people to kind of overinflate maybe the importance of their results. So we have this kind of notion of the p-value, and we've kind of touched on this before, but I want to really concretize and get this word in the ears of our listeners. What does it mean to p-hack?
Well, this is another term that came about around about the time of the replication crisis, that people realized that people were doing p-hacking. That is, they were running their analysis in such a way as to lower the p-value, but they weren't doing it in a consistent or principled way that actually made sense to do with their data. They were doing it in a way that essentially satisfied their biases. That is, to find positive results, to find P is less than 0.05. So the idea of just running the analysis a few more times, maybe, that participant, they weren't paying attention, so drop them out of the analysis and run it again and see what you get. And if you then at that point, having run the analysis, maybe you had 50 participants and you run it with 49, and then suddenly when you run the analysis with 49 participants, your p-value is less than 0.05. At that point, you say, that's good enough. I'll publish that. We'll send that off for publication. That sounds like a kind of absurd caricature, but it's actually something which happens very commonly in research, and people have admitted to this. They kind of look back at their previous research and said, actually, a lot of the stuff I was doing was probably unreliable for those p-hacking reasons. That's one. Dropping participants is one thing you can do. Running, as I mentioned, running an extra covariate, so controlling for something that you didn't plan to control for. Once you've looked at the results, is another way. Running lots and lots and lots of measures and then just cherry picking the ones that were statistically significant is another way to p-hack. That is to find less results that have p-values less than 0.05, but that don't actually reflect the full reality of what you were doing. Another way of thinking about it actually is that p-hacking is a bit like publication bias, but at the level of a single paper or a single analysis, because you're only you're picking and choosing the p-values that are statistically significant and publishing them, and not publishing all the other analyses you ran that had p-values of 0.06 or 0.5 or something, really, really high p-values that all scientists, fear to see in their analysis. And so it's this unprincipled way of doing it. Obviously, in some cases, people can run different analyses. Maybe it's actually really interesting to control for socioeconomic status and see what the results look like after that control, whatever it happens to be. That's a very common thing to add new analyses to a paper and check the sensitivity of the results to different situations. That's completely fine. But the problem is when people come in and say, we don't really have a plan for this analysis, so we're just basically going to keep doing it. And then your cognitive biases tell you to stop when you get a result that looks like it's publishable. And so that's where this the systemic stuff we've been talking about, the journals favoring significant results, has a real influence over the way that scientists are actually doing the maths in their studies. Because when you see that 0.05, the thing that comes up in your mind is, now I can publish. So, and that's leading to terrible biases in the literature.
Yeah, it's really a lot to wrap one's mind around. What I like about this kind of emerging new study of the problems in science is that there's some great terminology. We've talked about this file drawer problem. We've got this idea of p-hacking. Let's just do one more to get kind of these fun words on the table. It's called hypothesizing after the results are known, or harking. So what does it mean? And this is another kind of issue with statistical analyses, very closely related to this idea of p-hacking. But what is harking?
This is something you see quite commonly in medical trials, actually. And in medical trials, they have the slightly more boring name for it of outcome switching, which is nowhere near as fun as harking. But harking is where you run your analysis and then you think, well, what hypotheses would have been compatible with this analysis? What could I have said before I ran this analysis that would have meant that I was proved right by these data? So, say you run, say your trial that you've done is of a drug to reduce people's headache, say, and then you collect a few different measures, headache, and you also measure blood pressure, say. And it turns out that your drug didn't actually measure it doesn't actually have any effect on headache, but it does lower people's blood pressure. So then you can say to yourself, well, let's write the hypothesis up as if this study was about blood pressure all along. And you think that sounds quite blatant, but it happens all the time in medical literature, and there's loads of evidence that lots of clinical trials have been switched. The outcome has been switched in this way, and you can always make it sound plausible to yourself, like, oh yeah, I was kind of interested in blood pressure. I mean, I wouldn't have included it as a variable in the analysis if I wasn't going to look at it, and so what was planned as a kind of secondary, maybe interesting but not that important analysis becomes the main exciting part of the analysis, and the one that you write up as the primary part of your study. So that harking problem can really come in when you haven't planned things out in advance. That you basically are, like I said before, letting the data lead you into the analysis and your hypothesis that you're making, rather than having a really strong theoretically derived hypothesis that you plan to test right from the start, and then you get your data and you test only that hypothesis and that's it, which is kind of how things should be. But the problem is that papers are written up as if this kind of process of kind of just bumbling around until you find something was what people had planned all along. So there's this difference people draw in the literature between exploratory research on one hand and confirmatory research on the other. So exploratory research is basically what I just described there. You're kind of just checking out what's related to what, and you're just running some statistical analysis just to see what happens and checking a few things. And confirmatory research is where you really have a clear hypothesis and then you go out and test it. And the problem is that scientists do exploratory research and then write it up as if it was confirmatory research. So they write their hypotheses basically after they've done the analysis. And that's what harking is.
It sounds like a lot of what we're talking about and is kind of getting to this idea that the real enemy here is unpreparedness, or not planning your analysis ahead of time, because it seems like we've got this, what they call the garden of forking paths. There's so many different ways to run your possible analyses. I think this is maybe one misconception about statistics, like we discussed before, is that, like you said, there's never just one test you can possibly run. There's a theoretically infinite many possible analyses you can run on your data, and then infinitely many ways you could theorize about it after you've done your analyses. So we've got these kind of p-hacking manipulations, and then this harking, right? We can play with the statistics and then play with our theories, like with infinite degrees of freedom, and then say whatever we want about it. And so it seems like the solution is to kind of specify in advance what it is we're doing and how we're planning to analyze it. And that is the process of pre-registration. So maybe I'd love it if you could speak a bit about what is pre-registration, how does it work, and how it could be used to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, this is an idea that comes from medical trials, actually, which have been required to be registered since about 2000, the year 2000, and then it kind of became a requirement for publication in 2004. So around about that time, kind of turn of the century, people started talking about registration for clinical trials, and that's because these are, large taxpayer-funded projects which were sometimes just disappearing. If they didn't get the results that the pharmaceutical company that was running the study wanted, they would often just disappear into the file drawer and nobody would hear from them again. So as a way of sort of shaming the pharmaceutical companies into publishing these results, they would make sure that the government or the journals would make sure that they were registered beforehand. So we make sure that there was a clear list of every medical trial that had human participants on government websites. So it was clinicaltrials.gov is the website. And whenever you run a clinical trial, you would write it down. And then there's an amazing study from a few years ago where they looked at the number of studies that had positive results before the requirement for registering them. And then the number of studies that had positive results after registration came in. And after registration, the number of positive results goes down dramatically. So you get much more of the null results. And presumably, the implication of this is that those null results were always there. It's just that they were hidden away in the file drawers before the registration kind of shamed people into publishing them. Because if your study is written down on a website somewhere and then you don't publish it for the next 20 years go by and you've not published it, people are going to think you're being somewhat dishonest. So, and by the way, I said pharmaceutical companies there, but obviously it doesn't have to be pharmaceutical companies. It can be, universities or non-profits that run drug trials. So, and that's not been, you might notice a contradiction between my previous answer and that one where I mentioned the outcome switching thing, because even though people register trials, they still often switch the outcome and they still often, screw about with the statistics. So it's not a, panacea in any sense, but it is something that is now being brought into other subjects because people realize that, as you say, unpreparedness is really the major enemy here. It's so easy to reason yourself into an analysis or a hypothesis that you didn't actually plan. And so what researchers are now doing is, or they're being encouraged to do, and lots of journals are now encouraging people to do this and making this part of their kind of publication methods, is writing down an analysis plan before you touch any of the data and posting it publicly on the internet. So you basically, it's like I say in the book, it's like Odysseus tying himself to the mast when they're going past the sirens in the Odyssey, and he's therefore not tempted to do any other analyses. He's not tempted to do all that stuff we talked about before with p hacking. He's just runs one analysis. He just and isn't tempted by the siren's call of p hacking. His hands are tied, and it basically ties the scientist's hands and stops them mucking about with the data. Now, some scientists at this point say, "Well, wait a minute, doesn't that stop me exploring the data that I then collect? Maybe there's something I didn't predict that I find." And there's lots of serendipitous discoveries in the scientific literature. Penicillin being the most famous one, which Alexander Fleming didn't plan. He didn't write down a pre-registration that he was going to look for the mold growth that eventually became penicillin, but he did discover it anyway. But the point is that you just be honest and transparent about what you were doing. So you can write down your pre-registration plan, and then in your paper, when you eventually write the paper, you can say, we did all the analyses that we pre-registered, we wrote down and posted online, we've done all them. Now we're going to have a bit of fun, we're going to explore the data, and we're going to try some things that we've thought of since then. That's completely fine. That's totally okay to do that, as long as you're being transparent about what you did. And as I say, the problem in the past has been that people do all the exploration and then write it up as if it was a confirmation of a hypothesis that they always had. That's where one of the big advances has happened recently. And there's one extra little bit to this, which is the idea of a registered report, which is where the journal actually says to you, we will peer review your study plan, basically. So you tell us what you're going to do. We're going to send that to peer reviewers. Instead of waiting for you to collect all the data and all that, and then send it to peer reviewers, we're going to send your general study plan to the peer reviewers, and they will work with you to make the study good. They'll work with you to make the study acceptable. And at that point, we will say, we will publish the study no matter whether the results are positive, negative, ambiguous, all over the place, whatever it happens to be, hard to interpret. We will publish it no matter what. And at that point, you've killed publication bias, right? Because you've got a paper, you've got that all-important publication, you've got that all-important line on your CV, no matter whether your results are positive or negative or anything in between. And so it takes away this weird motivation that people have for finding positive results all the time, because they know that will help them get published, because the journal's already said they'll publish it. So that this idea of doing a registered report, only you get your method reviewed, and then you go out and collect the data, and then whatever those data look like, it gets published in the journal. It's just a great idea. Several hundred journals are now offering this as a way of publishing, which they never did before. It's still a tiny minority of all journals that exist in the world, but it's getting there. We're making some progress in changing the way that journals look at publishing papers. And I would, personally, it's not that I think that every single paper that isn't a registered report is dodgy in some way, but I would put more stock in a registered report than one which you just can't know, or even one that just has a pre-registration where they've written their analysis plan online, compared to a study where you just can't know whether the hypotheses were written down and the analyses were planned out in advance of the data being collected.
It's really interesting you writing this book as a psychologist and being able to kind of go into some of these issues of human bias in how we do these analyses. When you're talking about any researcher can reason their way into any analysis, you do a certain analysis and then you get your good p-values and then you publish that. And so it's this interesting psychological phenomenon of needing to tie yourself to the mast, giving yourself as few degrees of analytical freedom as possible. And I guess the registered report is an amazing way to do that, to make sure that that you're putting the constraints on your own mind in order to produce the best possible science. So I think that you have a unique perspective on these problems as a person who studies the human mind yourself. Maybe we can talk about one other kind of solution to these problems, and then we can wrap up. is the system of publication itself. So we've been talking mostly about how scientists work, but maybe we can talk a bit about how journals work. In particular, the open access movement, open science in general, the role of preprints. Many people in science are well aware that there have been increasingly many preprint servers where people can publish their unpeer-reviewed manuscripts, just kind of in raw form, to put on the internet so that other scientists can see their work and comment on it and incorporate it into the literature. What is the role of kind of open science, open data, freely available papers in your vision of a scientific future that avoids many of the issues we've spent the last hour speaking about?
Well, it all goes back to the same issue, which is that scientists are not transparent enough about their research. And again, I don't mean that in a they're trying to hide something, although clearly there are cases where that's true. But scientists are just have just generally got themselves into a way of working that is not transparent and open. And the open access movement and the open science movement more generally is a way of trying to shed a bit more light on the scientific process, bring a bit more light as the best disinfectant, I suppose, to the scientific process. So, as you say, it has many different aspects. So, starting with open access, it's this thing which many people will have encountered, which is they try to access a scientific paper that maybe they've seen discussed in the media, or they've read. Or they've read about it in a book, or they're looking up some new medical treatment that their doctors suggested to them, whatever it happens to be, and they find that the paper is behind a paywall, which is weird because they often have paid for that paper through their taxpayer money, if it was a government-funded bit of research. So it's strange that they can't read about it, they can't look up the statistics. Oddly, the scientists themselves can't access it either unless their university subscribes to the journal and pays lots of money. So actually, the taxpayer is then paying again for the money. So they for the research. So they've paid for the research to be done. They've then paid their universities again through their taxpayer money, who have to subscribe to these journals. So there's a kind of double payment system going on there. And of course, peer reviewers, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, they don't get paid for their contributions. So loads of that money, it just goes into the profit margin of the companies that run the journals, which make huge profits on their work. And that would be fine if they made huge profits if what they were doing was particularly useful or particularly improved the quality of science in some dramatic way. I don't particularly think that they are doing that much to improve the quality of the science or the quality of the papers that they publish. I think the contribution of publishers is quite limited. But anyway, the open access movement seeks to solve that by trying to make papers available to anyone who wants to read them. And this has been a movement in some large part on the part of funders, research funders, who now say you're going to have to publish your data. Your paper in a way that's accessible to everyone. Otherwise, we won't give you any money, or we'll give you extra money to pay the open access fees at the journal that you're sending your research to, so that it's made open to everyone. So that's one part of the kind of open science movement is making research more open, and there's been some big successes in that, and there's some interesting stuff happening now as well, with governments kind of banding together and saying we want our research to be made open access, and journals are kind of are having to, or the journal publishers are having to change the way they think about publishing research, because governments are going to ban researchers from submitting their papers to journals that kind of put them behind paywalls. So there's some interesting stuff happening with that I talk about in the book. But the broader open science movement also encourages things like open data. So putting your data sets online so anyone can access them, including the peer reviewers of the paper that you're submitting. So anyone can see what you're doing. Anyone can check your maybe putting your code online as well, your analytic code, your statistical analysis, so everyone can see it. So people aren't just relying on your work in the paper, the way you summarize your data. They're actually seeing those data for themselves. They're seeing those data for real. And the motto of the UK's Royal Society, the kind of science supporting organisation, is take nobody's word for it. And open science is basically that, is that you shouldn't be taking anyone's word for it. You should just be as transparent as you possibly can, and you shouldn't ask people to take your word for the findings that you've made. So that's another aspect. Preprints that you mentioned are also part of this, where scientists put up their analysis, put up their an early version of their paper online for the whole world to see, and then solicit comments on it from other scientists before they send it to the journal for its final publication. So that kind of puts a new layer of scientific discussion into the process between the study being done and its publication. You can get a lot of peer review happening on those preprints. So they happen before the formal peer review occurs. So there's a lot more open discussion. Obviously, preprints are open to the world, so anyone can see them as well. So that's obviously part of the open access movement as well, I guess. And that's a new way of sort of advancing science as well. You don't have these really long waits between, finishing a study and then having it published in a journal, which can sometimes take months or years, because scientists and editors and peer reviewers are all very busy, and one doesn't blame them for that. But that's just how the process is. But if you just upload your preprint online, then the world can see it immediately, and that's caused huge advances in areas like genetics, where the research is really moving very, very fast, and there's all these new techniques appearing and being put out into the world, assessed. You can put up your new technique at the start of the week, and someone's using it on their data by the end of the week because of the preprint process. Whereas that would have taken months and months if you had waited for formal journal acceptance and publication and so on. So the pace of science is speeding up as well. People are putting their data online. People are sharing their results with the world. And they're pre-registering them too, as we mentioned, and that's kind of part of the whole thing of being open and transparent. And the reason that this can happen now, whereas it would be much more difficult just a few years ago, is technology. We have now lots of websites, repositories online, tools, journal websites are being remade to make this, make things more transparent. For instance, peer reviews are now sometimes published alongside the article, and actually you can see the previous versions of the article before it went through the review process and after it went through the review process. So you get a full, transparent view of everything that happened all the way through the publication process, which, if you go back to what we were talking about right at the very start of the podcast, this just never would have happened. People, all of the peer review was done completely in complete privacy. So it just shines a light on the whole process, opens it up to the whole world, and lets people see exactly what's going on. And, that is really the fundamental thing, is that scientists have just not been truthful enough about what they've been doing. Some of them deliberately, and some of them, just unconsciously have done stuff which makes their report of their experiment untruthful, whereas it should be it should be an accurate report of exactly how they went about their research. So the open science movement, I think, that barely scratched the surface of what's been a huge kind of revolution in the way that we publish stuff. It may yet be the thing which solves a lot of these problems in science. I mean, obviously, we need major changes in our incentive process. We have to move away from this idea of constantly being obsessed with positive results, and the way that journals work, the way that universities promote people, and the way that funders give money to people, and just the things that scientists are interested in also need to change. But I'm kind of, whenever I think about the open science movement and the fact that it seems to be growing on campuses, you get all these open science clubs and lecture series about open science and so on that are popping up everywhere, and people obviously are using social media and the internet more generally to share lectures, share materials, share ideas about open science. So when I see that, it makes me feel somewhat more optimistic, even if thinking about all the fraud and bias and negligence and hype can sometimes get you down.
You have an amazing illustration in the book. There's a popular comic about climate change where there's someone giving a presentation and they're saying, green jobs and clean energy and better infrastructure and train transport and et cetera. All these great things that could be built in the process of solving, climate change. And someone in the audience raises their hand and says, "What if climate change is a hoax and we make the world better for nothing?" And you have a phenomenal kind of reframing of that comic where you say free registration and open access and no p hacking and better peer review. And, it's this kind of idea of even if there was no replication crisis, even if a lot of these issues didn't even exist, all these kind of changes you're proposing would make science so much better and so much more truth-seeking as an enterprise. So I really, really loved that you emphasized that point. Of course, we do have a replication crisis, just as climate change is real. And so all the more reason to kind of press on with a lot of these changes. I know we've barely scratched the surface of kind of the solutions part of the book. Frankly, we've barely scratched the surface of the book as a whole. Like the subtitle says, you speak about fraud, bias, negligence, and hype. We've really only touched on the bias part of that, those four in this conversation. So if listeners are interested in how scientific fraudsters and downright mistakes and how kind of media hype can distort the scientific process, they will have to read. I'd like to finish with one final question, which is about maybe your general thought in writing this book as a whole. Some might question why, in an era where science is perceived to be under attack, you would choose to write a book criticizing science as a scientist, but you make the really, really compelling point that errors in scientific practice, false results, the replication crisis, does far more to undermine the trust in science than any criticism you could level at it. Could you speak a bit more about how you view your role as a kind of insider, maybe a critic of science and trying to reform science, as not undermining trust in science?
Yeah, I mean the worst possible interpretation of this book and the most incorrect interpretation of this book is that science is completely irreparably flawed, and so I can just believe anything I want. Like I can just believe that evolution didn't happen, or I can believe that vaccines don't work, or I can believe that the climate isn't being influenced by human activity, and so or whatever it is, whatever weird belief you want to have. So that would be the most incorrect belief, the most incorrect way of interpreting the book. Because what I'm trying to do in this book is make science more rigorous, is make everyone raise their standards, no matter who they are, no matter what scientific field they work in. I want everyone to have higher standards on what they accept as evidence, and so the idea is that climate change denial or creationism or anything like that, if we raise the standard of evidence, then they would not be even worthy of a mere mention. But I'm doing this because I think science is really important. I'm doing this because science is the best invention that humanity has ever made. Essentially, science is the best way of discovering new things about the world. It's improved our lives immensely in almost every single different way that we could imagine, and it's something which is really precious. And unfortunately, a lot of the ways that science is being done now in academia, in the kind of the university system, and in the scientific publication system more broadly, are corrupting science. They're making that really precious thing that we've designed as humans. They're making it unreliable. They're making the scientific literature become not a clear record of what we've done, but a really biased catalogue of all our kind of human failings. And so, what this book is trying to say is that we need to bring science up to what we aspire it to be, which is this, this reliable record. It doesn't need to be truth, doesn't need to be absolute truth. In fact, reaching the absolute truth is probably not something that we could ever do. But it should be an accurate summary of us trying to get there and becoming less wrong all the time. And so at the moment, we have a system that makes scientists more interested in publishing flashy, false, positive papers that look good, rather than publishing true, robust, but maybe a little bit more boring research. And getting science back on track is going to be the best thing for science, rather than just saying to people, well, science is flawed. We can just believe in anything we want. So I'm writing this book from the perspective of someone who loves science and thinks that it's the most important thing we have, not as someone who is trying to get people to mistrust science in any way.
Well, Stuart, I am with you. I love science, and I hope that our listeners do too, and recognize that the problems that you identified are real and pervasive, but solvable and tackleable, and definitely it can be possible to have a better, more robust, more truth-seeking, more replicable science in the future. So thank you for writing this book. It really, truly is a brilliant page-turner that anyone interested in science, especially I would say practitioners of science in really all fields, we've kind of maybe, I certainly think about psychology a lot because that's what I'm interested in, but you really touch on so many different branches of science. So anyone interested in how science works, and especially whoever plans to do any form of scientific practice in their life, I think can gain so much from this book. So I appreciate you writing it, and I appreciate you speaking with me today about science fiction.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you like the book, and it's been really nice to chat.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.